Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming again twice in a week to the Institute. That's really good. But I'm sure coming tonight is a very good idea, and you will be very well rewarded with the presence here of our friend Sidney Jones of the International Crisis Group. I don't know how much you know about the International Crisis Group, but it used to be run by a former foreign minister of ours, who will be very familiar to you, Gareth Evans. And he breathed a lot of energy and life into it. And the idea of the International Crisis Group is to try actually and avert crises by getting in there and understanding where there's potential for disputes, where there's conflict, whether it be racial or whether it be political or any kind of conflict, and then trying to develop policies for politicians which could then lead to some kind of resolution before conflict breaks out into some kind of war. I think she could be useful up in Canberra these days, actually, between Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, but her base is Jakarta, Indonesia. She looks after Southeast Asia for the International Crisis Group and heads a team of analysts there who are constantly producing reports which go to governments. There was one recently on Malaysia which alerted people to some of the potential problems which might be coming up in that country. And of course, in Indonesia we have an election coming up in the not too distant future also, but it's a wide brief, and Sidney is going to talk to us about democracy and threats to democracy as she sees it in the Southeast Asian region. Now, before joining the International Crisis Group, she was with Amnesty International for many years. You all know about Amnesty and the work that it does, and was involved, of course, on the fringes of many conflicts there as well, which she'll tell you about. So please welcome Sidney Jones.
Thank you, Colin. Very good to be back here. I think I was here about 5 years ago, and I just remembered what a lovely setting it was, and also the fact that I got better questions in this audience than I got on almost any other venue that I've talked at. So. And tonight I'm going to be focusing on Indonesia exclusively rather than Southeast Asia more broadly, but if in the questions and answers you want to expand it to the rest of Southeast Asia, that's fine as well. I want to focus today on basically how democracies like Indonesia cope or should be coping with threats to democracy that come from groups that use democratic space for fundamentally anti-democratic ends. This is the good news first. This is what you all know. This is one of the narratives that you frequently hear about Indonesia as the success story. This is the great, and it's all true. This is the great democratic transition. Indonesia probably had a more trouble-free transition than almost any other country you can name. It was such a model for easing the military out of a political role that when we had the Arab Spring, many people suggested that Indonesia should become a model for Egypt or Tunisia or other places. It's a place where no thanks to political developments and no thanks to the legal system, it's managed to maintain a very impressive rate of economic growth. We've had free and fair elections, some exceptions, but generally amazingly trouble-free since the democratic transition began. We had what people call a Big Bang decentralization, where we went from about 261 districts in Indonesia to now more than 500, and a devolution of power from the center to those districts with lots of corruption and lots of problems, but not the kind of upheaval one might have expected. And we have Indonesia playing a major role in the region. Again, mostly as a leading player in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. It would like to be a much bigger player internationally, but doesn't really have the capacity to do so. Indonesia would like to be the country that solves Kashmir, North Korea, Middle East, and so on. Doesn't really have the capacity to do that yet. And we also have a lively parliament, if not as lively as it would like to imagine its own image would be. One success that Australians have been very involved in has been in the fight against terrorism. And I don't think anybody questions the fact that Indonesia has made fairly remarkable strides in curbing terrorism through a process that treated terrorism as a law enforcement problem and not as a military war. And I think that's critical because the people who were accused of terrorism were arrested by police, brought to trial, tried in open trials with full media coverage, and then, to the consternation of some Australians, Americans, and others, and some Indonesians, let go after their sentences were up, which hasn't happened in some other countries. In the process of creating a police counterterrorism unit called Detachment 88, there have been a number of instances of killings by police of suspected terrorists, and certainly some abuses that have taken place in the course of arresting suspected terrorists that have turned the police into the number one enemy, not just of violent extremists, but of many others in the Islamist community that see the police as being an agent of the destruction of Islam, and that has become has created serious problems. But we have also seen, over the last 5 years in particular, the weakening to the point of emasculation of the group called Jemaah Islamiyah that all Australians know as having been responsible for the Bali bombs. Jemaah Islamiyah is basically out of the violence game now. It is the target of severe criticism on the part of the other extremist groups for having abandoned jihad. But it's also had consequences, because once that large, regional, well-trained organization was basically weakened to the point of serious decline by the arrests that took place on the part of the Indonesian police, it led to the fragmentation and the emergence of other groups, splinters, sometimes of Jemaah Islamiyah, sometimes with no connection to JI, that were willing to take militancy on different tracks and were willing to, and were concerned that the organization that had been the leader of the terrorist movement was no longer willing to engage in these kinds of tactics. The other big success in Indonesia, or one other big success, was the complete, and I mean complete, restoration of civil liberties that took place as a result of the democratization process, particularly basic civil liberties, freedom of expression, association, and assembly. But if you look at Indonesia in the last 5 years, what we've seen is that the groups that are taking advantage of those freedoms in the most systematic and strategic way are some of the Islamist civil society groups who are interested in using that democratic space to promote a very hardline agenda that includes very strong involvement of the state in protecting morality, that involves trying to push for the application of Islamic law and many other things. But it's a It's a very calculated use of democratic space. When I talk about Islamist civil society, there are a number of groups. I'm sure you've heard of some of these, but it includes groups like the Islamic Defenders Front, FPI. It includes groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an international organization with a very, very active Indonesian branch, which does a lot of recruiting on Indonesian university campuses. Very well-educated recruits. One of their strictures is that you have to have an answer to any question. So they actually train their recruits to be able to answer any question on any subject, leading to an answer that Islam is the solution. And they're a millenarian organization in some ways, or a utopian organization, in that they want to see the reestablishment of the caliphate that last existed in 1924 when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And they see the gradual application of Islamic principles in Indonesia as being the first step toward recreating the caliphate. That is, Indonesia and other places can be stepping stones on the way to the recreation of this. We also have groups such as one called Forum Umat Islam, FUI, led by somebody who used to be a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And the characteristic of these groups is they're extremely strategic. When I see the kinds of things they're doing as advocacy organizations, I think I used to work for Human Rights Watch in New York, and we didn't really have a mass constituency in the United States, but what we tried to do was to find an agenda, find people in the government that were sympathetic to that agenda, try and push that in pursuit of human rights, and try and persuade more people to come on board in that process. And that's exactly what Hizb ut-Tahrir, FPI, FUI, and some of these other organizations are trying to do, but they're far better at it than we were ever as human rights organizations. And they're certainly far better at it in Indonesia than any advocacy organizations working in the field of human rights, environment, women's rights, or anything else. When we talk about civil society in Indonesia, these are the groups that have the real strategic thinking behind them. And as I note here, these are also groups, and not just these national level groups, but also similar kinds of groups at a local level that have militant wings that engage sometimes in violence in terms of raiding brothels or bars or places that they see as dens of iniquity. They're the places that close down restaurants that are serving food during Ramadan. They're the places that shut down the Gay Film Festival in Jakarta. They're also the kinds of groups, especially at a local level, that move against minorities such as sects that are seen as deviant, like the Ahmadiyya sect. They are the people that try to prevent churches from being constructed and mobilize local mobs, basically, to go along with them. So these are the groups that have filled some of this room created by the democratization in Indonesia. So one of the things that we've seen in the last 5 years, and there's a reason for the fact that it's been within the last 5 years, but we've seen two developments that taken together are cause for concern. One of them is that we've seen a number of people who've been involved in these Islamist civil society groups cross over into violent extremism. We never saw that in the past, but that's something, if you look at even the 50 or so people that have been arrested in the last 6 months on terrorism charges, about a quarter of them came out of these civil society groups. And we had one example here of a man who detonated a bomb vest at a police mosque in Cirebon in central Java, who had been involved in raids against the Ahmadiyya, and had also bashed up a 7-Eleven store for selling, or something the equivalent of a 7-Eleven store for selling beer. But he had gotten his start in these anti-vice raids. And the second is that increasingly these civil society organizations that are leading campaigns against vice, deviance, apostasy, and so on are increasingly bringing in jihadi groups as part of that campaign. So the merger is taking place at two levels. We've got, at a very local level, people taking part in anti-vice organizations moving into violent extremism. And then at a national level, mostly, we're seeing involvement of jihadi groups in campaigns run by these civil society groups. And the alliances are taking place both at a national and a local level. One of the reasons that the Islamist civil society groups have been able to become as powerful as they are does have a link to the fact that in 2005 we started having elections at a local level. And once we started having local officials directly elected, we also started having those officials or those campaigns being open to pressure from various advocacy groups. And it meant that you don't have to be a member of an Islamic political party to have influence over a candidate who is running for office if that group can persuade the candidate that it is speaking on behalf of an important constituency. So we've actually seen a decline in Islamic political parties in Indonesia. We've seen a decline in the size and the vote-getting ability, but we've seen a rise in the political influence, particularly at a local level, of these same groups. Now, if we look back before 5 years ago, any kind of tactical alliance between violent extremists and civil society groups was unthinkable. At the time that JI, Jemaah Islamiyah, was at its height, it saw itself as a completely clandestine body. It would be foolhardy to engage in any kind of alliance with an open, above-ground organization. JI wanted an Islamic state and was working actively against the government. Many of the civil society groups had no problem with the Indonesian Republic, and indeed, in some cases, were the creation of security forces and worked very closely with security forces. The Islamist civil society groups were very much against terrorist tactics, didn't want any involvement with those tactics at all. JI, of course, had no problem with suicide bombing. And JI also had a Salafist, very ultra-Puritan religious orientation, whereas the Islamist civil society groups were much harder to characterize in terms of their religious doctrine. So there was no possibility of any kind of alliance. And if you look at the people who were arrested for terrorism in Indonesia between, say, 1999 and 2007, there was nobody who came from this kind of Islamist background. What changed? A number of things. The decline of Jemaah Islamiyah was a very important factor, partly because JI's indoctrination and recruitment was all in-house. Once JI declined and pulled out of active violence, it was as though the remaining jihadi groups and people within JI who left to form splinter organizations were looking for ulama and religious preceptors from other organizations. So it encouraged this kind of interaction and mixing. We had about 5 very well-known hardline ideologues, and all jihadi groups and a lot of these Islamist civil society groups all sent people to study with these 5 people who were very well known. One of them is this man, Aman Abdurrahman here, who was in prison till 2008. Once he was released, his popularity and his charisma were such that people from across the radical fringe went to study with him, and he traveled around the country giving speeches, just as Abu Bakr Bashir, once he was released, had celebrity status in 2006, started traveling around the country, and people from a wide variety of backgrounds went to hear and study with him. Also, in 2008, the government issued a decree against the Ahmadiyya, restricting the activities of the Ahmadiyya sect as a result of some of the campaigning by these Islamist civil society groups. One of the things that resulted in was a recognition that you actually got further through advocacy and public pressure than you did through bombing or violence. So some of the jihadists began to say, maybe we can get further in pursuit of our Islamist goals by making an alliance than we can with just bombing. So it was another seeing that these campaigns actually resonated with the public at a local level, and also seeing that they actually could change public policy was something that I think facilitated these kinds of interactions. We also had the creation in 2008 of JAT, which is Abu Bakr Bashir's new organization, which was by definition a hybrid organization with an above-ground part that worked for the application of Islamic law, but also an underground clandestine part. And I think that hybridization, combined with Bashir's own celebrity status, also helped some of this merger. But the point is that all of these changes took place around late 2007, 2008, and it's at that point that we begin to see the first of these crossovers from civil society to jihadism. Also, in 2009, we had this Jakarta hotel bombings and the death of the Malaysian JI member who had left JI and was leading his own group. And once he died, it became, first of all, easier for some of the Islamist groups that saw him as toxic to join forces with some of the jihadi groups. But also, once he died, there was a lot of rethinking and reflection and introspection within the jihadi movement, saying, well, look what happened. Every time he did something, what we had was a wave of arrests. It destroyed the movement. Maybe we should not focus so much on indiscriminate bombing of civilians, but move towards other kind of more targeted attacks. And this led to a focus on the police. And the one other factor that helped facilitate this was in early 2010, we had an alliance of about 9 different groups that set up an extremist training camp in Aceh. The police found out about this camp, broke it up. In the course of the operations that followed, they killed about 24 people and arrested more than 100 in a way that touched almost every radical group in Indonesia, creating even more of a hatred against the police than we had before. So this, the after effect of this particular operation also helped crystallize the idea that police were the #1 enemy and everybody had to join forces in fighting them. Also, you also began to have reflections in the extremist community that we have no support. There was a recognition, we have no popular support in Indonesia. We are not like Iraq, where we're under occupation. We are not like other places where there's a war going on and we have a rationale for jihad on Indonesian soil. So therefore, we have to think, what is it that we can do that will get popular support for our goals? And the idea of focusing on the police as the tool of repression of Islam in Indonesia was something that was far easier to understand than attacks on foreign targets. So all of this helps to explain why we've seen so many crossovers in the last 4 or 5 years. What's in it for the jihadists? Well, as I say, they understand that they need popular support, and tapping into local issues like popular antipathy toward the Ahmadis, or unhappiness with the construction of a church, or opposition to Lady Gaga's concert, which also generated lots of support from the extremist community, and lots of the mainstream as well. All of that was one factor that was involved. Also, I think that the jihadists realized that if they had some kind of tactical alliance with the broader community, that also increased their recruitment pool. And we've seen a lot of efforts to recruit from people who were involved in some of these anti-vice campaigns. Some of the jihadi groups also saw anti-vice campaigns as a testing ground for young potential recruits. That is, if people were willing to go to the top of the front of the line to bash down a bar or bash down a brothel, maybe they were people that had the potential to use violence even further, and that was another factor. And you began to see in writings within the jihadi community a notion that to achieve an Islamic State, maybe it was a good idea to have a division of labor. We can be the military on the one side, but you also need the people who are willing to work for Islamic principles in other forms. What's in it for the Islamist civil society? Many of the groups that have made this tactical alliance are not interested in violence and would never use violence themselves, but they find it very, very valuable to have the police as the enemy, because they want to portray Indonesia as a place that is ruled by a secular leadership that's basically a puppet of the West, and that is systematically targeting and stigmatizing Islam at the instruction of the Americans, the Australians, or anybody else you want to name. And it fits within an ideological framework. Therefore, when people get arrested on charges of terrorism, these groups, in all of their media, both online, print, and other forms, portray the people arrested either as innocent victims of a repressive state, or as people who are unfairly being accused of terrorism when other people who commit the same crimes are not charged with terrorism. And increasingly we're seeing these people make a comparison with Papua, basically saying if Muslim activists kill 2 policemen, they are accused of terrorism. If 2 Papuan separatists kill 2 policemen, they're accused of murder. Therefore, the police are actively discriminating against Muslims and being used as a tool of repression. And the excessive use of force, which is undeniable by the counterterrorism unit, hasn't helped in this particular regard. We're seeing many shared talk shows on particular issues and public events where some of these well-known ulama attract people from both sides of the nonviolent and violent side of the radical fringe. We're seeing an increasing rise in the importance of the internet in terms of use of recruitment, communication, and so on. There's a lot of talk in Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore and Malaysia, about self-radicalization, people that get radicalized just by reading stuff over the internet. Up until now, it almost has never happened in Indonesia. You need face-to-face interaction. But for the first time, we're beginning, we have one very clear case, and maybe a second, where people who read some of the postings on jihadist sites went through other organizations to try to get introduced to the people who were actually behind those writings. So the internet is serving as a meeting ground, particularly chat forums. But we also had an outbreak of violence in September 2011 in Ambon, which had been the site of very intense communal fighting between Christians and Muslims. Another eruption of violence there, and the extremist site that had the best reporting about Ambon, but also the most tendentious, portraying everything that had happened as the result of deliberate efforts by a crusader force to stir up trouble in Ambon. It was picked up by virtually every other site and news source within the radical community. So back to the question of how does a democracy cope with these anti-democratic trends? It's very interesting that the jihadists basically take an absolutist position that democracy is completely Islam is completely incompatible with democracy because democracy has man-made laws and we should be subject to God-given laws. Some of the Islamist civil societies say, yes, that's true, and they're taking the purist position. We'll be a little bit more pragmatic and say that we'll be willing to use democracy as a temporary stepping stone toward more Islamic governance, but we need to protect the Ummah through enforcing, using the democratic system to enforce certain regulations on morality. But basically, there's an agreement that democracy is a political system that needs to be changed. The policy implications as a result of this are several. First of all, it means that when people talk about the need to challenge Islamist civil society, I think it's true that we need to find some way of supporting pluralism, but there's too much discussion that let's just go back to Pancasila, which was the state ideology promoted by Suharto and turned into a kind of legitimizing tool of conformity by an authoritarian state. It's not going to work, and you can't go back to an era that has passed. I think we have to look for new ways to think about what kind of society Indonesia wants to be. I think there are many Indonesians that are trying to think through how, in this change situation, do we promote pluralism. I think Detachment 88 has to be a lot more careful about how they go about operations. They're good. They've got the best intelligence about these networks, but they have created some very dangerous enemies by engaging in tactics that maybe were not completely necessary. I think many of the people killed, for example, probably could have been captured alive. Not in all cases, and I think it's difficult to second guess when you think people might have explosive vests on them, but I think there is some grounds for concern there. I think that the government has been far too lax about letting some of the civil society groups get away with minor kinds of violence, such as vandalism, or these kinds of smashing up of bars and brothels. I think there's got to be zero tolerance for that, and I think there's got to be very clear punishments of people who were involved in those networks, rather than implicit collusion or allowing these to take place. I spoke to a class of police at this Academy for Counterterrorism Training, which is very good. And I asked this group of police why they weren't willing to move against some of these groups that did commit clear crimes. And I got 3 answers. One of them was, we don't have orders. So unless orders come directly from the central part of Jakarta down to a local level, nobody's going to take responsibility for that. The second was, if we go after them, they'll come after us. And real fear that if they moved against mobs or groups that had any kind of standing in the community, particularly political standing, that was going to be a problem for the police later on. And the third one was an acknowledgement that that the police sometimes use these groups for different purposes, for their own purposes, and that therefore you wanted to hold them in reserve and not punish them because they could be useful to you on a future occasion. Finally, I think that Indonesia has to revisit the issue of hate speech. We have a country that won back civil liberties at great cost and it does not want to return most of its citizens, even with the nostalgia that you often hear for the Suharto era. Most people don't want to go back to a period where those civil rights were severely restricted. But the question is, where do you draw the line? And when you get groups urging death to particular minorities, which you hear, it seems to me that you have to determine that somewhere from at the top levels of government, you have to determine that this is criminal incitement and no longer free speech. But we haven't had a debate there, and we've had no leadership from the top to encourage that kind of debate. And I think this is one of the most difficult issues for Indonesia moving ahead.
Well, there you go. You couldn't get a better description of what's happening behind the scenes in Indonesia today. Sidney's happy to answer some questions. Perhaps I might start by throwing back something which Greg Feely said in this room just a month ago, in which he said that SBY was really good in his first term, but in his second term he appeared to have lost his grip, and things were sort of drifting out of control. Do you believe that? Do you think that's the case? What's the prospects?
I wouldn't say that he's lost his grip. I think he's made some very calculated decisions to ignore politically difficult issues. So that, for example, it's true that in his second term, we've seen him step back from criticizing almost anybody in his cabinet who makes outrageous statements. We have a minister of religion that he appointed because he was a critical member of the political coalition, who basically came out and said that Shiism, which has a substantial following in Indonesia, was a deviant sect. Nobody has called, for years in Indonesia, we've had Shia with no problem. But these hardline groups have been leading an anti-Shia movement. They pushed the minister of religion into saying that Shiism was deviant, and SBY said nothing. And I think that's completely reprehensible. He has let this man, who's a hardliner, even though he's from Nahdlatul Ulama, say anything he likes, most of which involve suggestions that anytime there's religious violence against minorities, it's the minorities' fault for not being good Muslims. And it's gone without any kind of censure from the man at the top. So I don't think he's lost his grip. I think it's a calculated political decision that I find completely reprehensible. I think it's very difficult to say. I think there are social forces at work in Indonesia which are going to be a challenge for anybody. Just because of the nature of the work I do, I focus a lot on the power of some of these Islamist groups, for example. And I think that that it will be difficult, but not impossible, for a new president to take a very firm line and draw a line in the sand against some of these groups. But Prabowo, who is got lots of problems in his background, is somebody who has said, if I am president, I won't allow these attacks to take place. And he said, if I am president and we have a local elected official who is defying a ruling by the Supreme Court, I will ensure that we enforce that ruling, regardless of what it takes, basically. So you're getting statements from him that suggest maybe what the Indonesian public wants in a president is a democratically elected authoritarian figure like Thaksin in Thailand or someone else. And we have one guy going around saying, I'm the Hugo Chavez of Indonesia. I know, just elect me, and what we need is firm social justice dictated from the top. And analogies back to the Suharto era, such as that. But I think, I mean, that's only one part of the kinds of issues Indonesia will be facing. I think Indonesian decentralization is an issue which is increasingly becoming problematic, because we're on a train that seems to have no end in terms of the fragmentation administratively of Indonesia. How many provinces are we eventually going to have in Indonesia? How many districts? We just have a new province of North Kalimantan, just enacted last week. That brings us up to 34 provinces, and as I say, the number of districts in Papua or Sulawesi or Kalimantan that are being created is just unbelievable. They're getting smaller and smaller, less and less functional, more and more defined by ethnic identity. What does that mean for Indonesia long term? We don't know, and nobody's thinking about that. Yeah, I mean, it's I'm not even sure that's an answerable question, but let me just say that, for example, the anti-Ahmadiyya campaign is something which resonates very deeply in mainstream Indonesian society. You're very hard-pressed to find an Indonesian who likes the Ahmadis, or who after now more than 5 years of an intense campaign against them, believes that they should be allowed to call themselves Muslim. You find, because that's the big problem with the mainstream Muslim community. Just for example, the most Muslim, and the Minister of Religion has said, well, if they call themselves the Ahmadiyya religion, we wouldn't have a problem. It's the fact they call themselves Muslims that's the problem. But on almost any of these issues, the extremists almost try to choose issues that they know will have resonance beyond their own constituency. So there's an effort to try and bring the mainstream on board. The gender equality law, one of the interns asked me about the gender equality law just before we started this. And there's a bill now for gender equality in the parliament. The extremist groups and a conservative wing of Muhammadiyah, which is a mainstream organization, have joined forces to campaign against the gender equality law on the grounds that it would permit same-sex marriage in Indonesia if adopted. I don't even know if a provision on same-sex marriage is in there, but that's how it's being portrayed by these groups in a way that has brought the mainstream of Muhammadiyah on board. With the Lady Gaga concert, it started out with this one organization, FUI, one of these Islamist society groups, and gradually all the mainstream organizations, Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, and so on, came on board. But it was the tail that wagged the dog of the broader community. Now, I think that this is where the strategic skills of some of the extremists come on board. What they would like is the application of Islamic law and at the very least a reintroduction of the Jakarta Charter that all Muslims would be obliged to obey Islamic law. I don't think they're going to get there in Indonesia. I don't think there's much danger that we're going to see a transformation of Indonesia into a Malaysia, let alone a Pakistan. But I think that this is what the groups are trying to do, using increased piety and increased social conservatism in the body politic as a vehicle for doing that. I'm not sure I can answer that across the board, because I don't have that much contact with secondary school students, but there's a concern on the part of some of my colleagues in the NGO community that that students have lost the kind of idealism that they had in 1998, and that, for example, the student demonstrations that you see now when they go to protest against fuel price hikes are all what they call demo pesanan. They wait to be paid to get on a bus before they'll go to a demonstration. And I think there's a lot of this, not just at a national level, but at a local level as well. On the other hand, you also see some phenomenally good, committed young people in Indonesia who are who are concerned about alleviating poverty, and who are concerned about protecting the environment, and who do have a sense of activism and so on. But I guess there's more of a pessimism now about whether the idealism that sparked the '98 student movement is still in place. So far, the military is standing on the sidelines, enjoying every minute of the police, of the antipathy toward the police. I mean, the hostility between the police and the military can be cut with a knife. The military is extremely unhappy at the way that the police have been elevated in democratic Indonesia. They are extremely unhappy with the amount of funding that they've received, particularly from counterterrorism programs. They are increasingly, particularly the Army, not so much the Air Force or the Navy. The Army is an organization that just seems confused about its role. The Air Force has its own role. The Navy can patrol the seas and so on. But what if the Army doesn't have internal security and you have no external threat to Indonesia? What is the Army's role? So you get all these gray areas of operations other than war that, according to legislation on the TNI, on the military, it's supposed to be engaged in. But even in all these gray areas, which is everything from people smuggling, narcotics, counterinsurgency, and so on, the police seem to have a more important role than the Army on all of these, and nobody has defined the exact division of labor between the two. As a result, the Army seems to be focusing on disaster relief as one of its major functions, but it does want to be back in the role. Nobody that I've talked to who's got real knowledge of the TNI believes that there's any chance of a military coup or disgruntlement has gotten to levels where it would become a serious threat to the stability of the state. And in fact, the fact that Indonesia is fragmenting into all these new districts and provinces means that in every level there's a possibility of a new military Kodim or Koramil sub-district or district unit being established, meaning that the rent-seeking opportunities for the military are still alive and well. But it doesn't answer the question of what the military can, or what the Army in particular can or should be doing. So I think it is a question for the future. For the moment, it doesn't look like the military, while unhappy, is any threat to the stability of Indonesia, let alone its democracy. I think we've seen, just in the last couple of weeks, one very clear result, because particularly Hizb ut-Tahrir, to a lesser extent this group called FUI, Forum Umat Islam, are in many ways leading the anti-globalization agenda within Indonesian civil society. And it was they, particularly Hizb ut-Tahrir, that led the petition at the Constitutional Court that resulted in the decision to eliminate that regulatory agency in oil and gas. And it was because of a very fundamentally anti-foreign stance that they have taken. And I think the potential for, I mean, first of all, I think they're going to see this as just total triumph and move on to something else in this sphere. That said, I actually think the bigger risk to foreign investors comes from the lack of certainty in the legal system and the fact that of all of the areas of reform in Indonesia, one completely unreconstructed area is the legal system. It's still horrible. There's very little progress that's been made in that area, despite a lot of money that's been put into reforms. So if I were a business person, I would actually be less worried about the impact of Islamist groups and a lot more worried about the fact that you still have such a problem in terms of sanctity of contracts or anything else on the legal front. I'm not sure Julia Gillard per se has made an impact on women's rights or human rights more generally. She's been pretty effective when she's come to Indonesia. I think she's been seen as somebody who's carried off those visits very well. I don't know whether this is the right audience to say it or not. She's a lot more popular than Rudd was when he came. Because Kevin Rudd used to go onto these long tangents in meetings with public officials that made a lot of the people around him squirm. But I think it would be difficult to point to a specific impact that she's had in Indonesia. Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely outrageous that he or anybody else on trial for terrorism charges should be allowed free access to the media. It's not a violation of your right as a prisoner to be denied access to the media. You know, nobody who's being accused of a serious felony deserves a right or is granted a right under international law to be able to talk to the BBC whenever he likes. So I think that there should be much tighter control over some of these people who are on trial. In some cases, the information or the interviews that have come out from responsible journalists based on interviews they've had with people who are on trial has actually played a public education role in convincing the Indonesian public that they actually did what they said they were accused of doing. And it's helped dilute some of the conspiracy theories that would otherwise be prominent about who was actually behind a bombing. That is not true for Bashir, and it's not true for a number of the other real hardcore ideologues that are there. And I think that there should be an absolute 100% ban on anybody on trial having systematic access to the media. As it turns out, it's actually Indonesian courtrooms are not very secure, and there's a move now to try and physically ensure that people who were brought to trial on terrorism charges are, and the witnesses who are brought are not subject to these swarms of media there. But I think there's something else that we recommended and got slammed for. But I think that there should be a ban on public speaking for anybody released from prison for the duration of their parole period, effectively. Because we have seen a lot of the people, as soon as they're released, Bashir was one, Aman Abdurrahman was another, and there are lots of them, who immediately went on the celebrity tour giving these lectures in a way which certainly helped organize JAT and which had an inimical role elsewhere in facilitating some of this interaction. And it would not take a new law. All it would take would be enforcement of parole conditions, but the kind of outcry that recommendation of ours caused, that we were wanting to silence the expression of Muslim activists, was such that I think it would be close to politically impossible for that to be enforced.